The morning of June 14th, 2003, rose clear and golden over Timber Falls, Oregon. The smell of wet pine lingered from the night's drizzle, and sunlight threaded through the branches like ribbons of hope. Kevin Blake tied the laces of his worn hiking boots, humming a tune his youngest son, Noah, had been obsessed with all week. He kissed Laura goodbye, promised he'd be back before sunset, and tossed his backpack into the bed of his silver pickup truck. He looked happy, calm in that way only people certain of their plans can be. "Take your phone this time," Laura reminded, leaning against the doorway with crossed arms. "I'll be back before it dies," he joked, flashing his warm, boyish grin. "Just a short trail, nothing fancy." Laura didn't smile back. "You always say that." Kevin walked up to her, pressed his forehead against hers. "Hey," he whispered, "I'll be fine. Tell the kids we'll camp next weekend." By noon, the sun burned through the haze, and Kevin's truck was seen parked neatly at the Timber Ridge trailhead. A few hikers remembered exchanging nods with him on the path, his blue jacket standing out against the green wilderness. After that, nothing. When he didn't return that evening, Laura called his phone, straight to voicemail. By midnight, panic replaced reason. She phoned the sheriff's office, her voice trembling as she repeated the same words. "He's not the kind of man to just vanish." Sheriff Daniel Harper arrived within the hour. A man of broad shoulders and steady eyes, Harper had known Kevin for years through the local volunteer fire department. "We'll start the search at dawn," he assured her. "Sometimes hikers lose track of time. We'll find him." But Laura couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet. The kids had drifted into uneasy dreams, Ben clutching his baseball glove, Emily curled against her pillow, Noah murmuring their father's name in half-sleep. Laura stood by the window, watching the rain return, streaking the glass like tears she refused to shed. At first light, search teams gathered at the trailhead. Volunteers, deputies, dogs, everyone who'd ever shared a beer or handshake with Kevin. The forest seemed endless, an ocean of cedar and fog swallowing every sound. Harper's radio crackled with updates, each one thinner in hope than the last. They found Kevin's truck still locked, keys missing. No sign of a struggle. No footprints beyond the first mile of the trail, where the ground turned rocky and confusing. "It's like he just stepped off the earth," muttered one deputy. By evening, Harper's expression had changed. Less official, more human. "We'll keep going," he told Laura. "These things take time." Laura nodded numbly, gripping the photo of Kevin she'd kept in her jacket pocket. She whispered to herself, "He knows these woods. He wouldn't get lost." But as night fell again over Timber Falls, the forest kept its silence. No movement, no trail, no Kevin Blake. If stories like this draw you in, subscribe for more true stories like this. Real lives, real mysteries that seek the truth. And in Timber Falls, that truth was only beginning to stir beneath the trees. In the weeks following Kevin's disappearance, Timber Falls felt smaller, as if the forest had swallowed more than a man. It had taken the air with it. The Blake house, once alive with laughter and music from the kids' chaotic mornings, now echoed with the sound of absence. Laura tried to hold it together. She made breakfast the way Kevin used to like it, black coffee, scrambled eggs, and a single slice of toast. But the kids barely touched their plates. 12-year-old Ben stared at the empty chair across the table, his jaw tight. "He said he'd be back before dark," he whispered once, voice cracking like glass. Emily, the middle child, spent hours sitting by the front window, sketching the shape of Mount Hood in her notebook. "If I draw it enough," she said to her mother one afternoon, "he might see the picture and find his way home." Laura only managed a nod, afraid her voice would betray the truth, that she no longer knew what to believe. Noah, too young to understand, still waited by the porch every evening, clutching the tiny compass Kevin had given him on his 5th birthday. "Daddy always finds his way," he'd say confidently. To everyone who'd known Kevin Blake, the idea that he could vanish willingly was impossible. He was the kind of man who showed up early to help neighbors fix their fences, who volunteered to coach Little League, even after a 12-hour workday. As a physical education teacher at Timber Falls High, he inspired his students with the same quiet integrity that guided his family life. Kevin was the kind of person who couldn't stand unfinished work, his colleague Mrs. Hampton told a reporter. He believed in follow-through, in everything. Yet as the days turned into months, quiet questions began to slip through the sympathy. Why had he gone hiking alone? Why hadn't he told anyone which trail he planned to take? One of his friends, Tom Riley, remembered a conversation just a week before Kevin disappeared. They had been repairing the school's old bleachers when Kevin paused mid-hammer and said, "There's something I need to set right. I've been putting it off too long." Tom had laughed it off then. Now the words haunted him. Sheriff Harper revisited every lead. There was no record of unusual financial activity, no hint of marital problems, no signs of distress. Laura faced questions she didn't know how to answer. Some neighbors whispered that maybe Kevin had wanted to start over somewhere else, overwhelmed by family and work. Others pitied Laura in silence. At night, when the kids were asleep, she'd sit by the back porch with a cup of cold coffee, replaying every memory, every phrase, searching for clues hidden in ordinary days. She remembered his tone the morning he left, steady but distant, as if his mind had already been somewhere beyond the trees. The uncertainty gnawed at her more than grief itself. Not knowing was its own kind of death. And as the summer of 2003 waned into autumn, one truth became undeniable. The perfect father, the devoted husband, the man who never left things undone, was gone without a trace. The morning after Kevin's disappearance, the trailhead buzzed with voices and radio chatter. Sheriff Harper stood beside his truck, scanning the tree line as mist rolled through the pines. "We'll sweep from Timber Ridge to the old fire road," he instructed, marking a map spread across his hood. Volunteers nodded, tightening their backpacks, adjusting flashlights, their breaths visible in the cool dawn air. Laura arrived holding Kevin's hiking photo. Her eyes were swollen, her hands shaking. "He always starts near the river bend," she said quietly. "He takes the longer path, says it clears his mind." Harper nodded, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "We'll bring him home, Laura." "I promise." As the first group entered the woods, the forest seemed to swallow them whole. The smell of damp earth rose thick around them, and every branch crack felt amplified in the silence. Deputies moved methodically, calling Kevin's name every few minutes. The echoes came back hollow, swallowed by the wind. By midday, rain returned, thin needles of drizzle that made the soil slick and treacherous. "He's a strong hiker," one volunteer muttered, gripping a walking stick. "Maybe he found shelter somewhere higher up." But Harper's gut twisted. He'd seen men lost to these woods before. The terrain could turn deadly in hours. The search expanded through the weekend. Helicopters circled overhead, their sound bouncing off cliffs. Search dogs caught brief scents that vanished in the cold current of the river. At one point, they found a faint footprint near a boulder field, but it led nowhere, erased by rain and mud. Harper knelt beside it, brushing away pine needles. "Could be him," he whispered, though his tone carried doubt. Meanwhile, the community gathered at the Timber Falls fire station. Volunteers cooked chili, sorted supplies, and marked maps with red pins. Laura refused to leave. She studied every route, memorized every ridge and trail name, her voice raw from repeating the same plea. Check the western slope again, he wouldn't have gone off trail. At night, Harper returned home exhausted, boots caked in mud. His wife met him at the door, but he barely spoke. He'd seen Laura sitting alone by the search board, clutching Kevin's flannel jacket someone had found near the parking lot, a jacket she swore he hadn't worn that morning. That single detail gnawed at him. After 2 weeks, the official search scaled down. Reporters drifted away and volunteers had to return to work. The forest had yielded nothing. No gear, no tracks, no clue. Harper gathered his team one final evening. The sun was sinking behind the ridge, painting the horizon in orange and grey. "We'll call it a suspension," he said heavily. "Not closure, never closure." When he told Laura, her face went pale. "You're saying you're giving up?" she said flatly. "I'm saying we've done all we can for now," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura's reply came cold and steady. "Then I'll keep searching." And as the sheriff watched her walk away, he knew she meant it. Autumn came early to Timber Falls that year. The leaves turned quickly, falling across the Blake family's front yard in silent waves of red and gold. Inside the house, time seemed to have stopped. Kevin's boot still sat by the door, his coffee mug still on the shelf, untouched since the day he disappeared. Laura tried to keep the routine alive for the children's sake. Every morning she packed lunches, reminded Ben to catch the bus, braided Emily's hair and tied Noah's shoelaces. But the smallest things undid her. The smell of pine soap, the creak of the back porch where Kevin used to sit with his guitar, the empty side of the bed, cold no matter how many blankets she pulled close. Bills piled up quickly. The insurance company refused to release Kevin's life coverage until he was declared legally dead, a process that could take 7 years. The school where she worked part-time offered extra hours, but it was never enough. "We can help," Mrs. Hampton offered gently one afternoon, handing Laura a grocery card. Laura smiled weakly. "Thank you. But I'll manage." The truth was, she wasn't managing. Each night she sat at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed, sorting through overdue notices and search flyers that had begun to yellow at the edges. Ben, now 13, tried to step into his father's shadow. He fixed the lawnmower, shoveled snow, and told Noah bedtime stories about heroes who always found their way home. But at school, he fought often, especially when kids whispered that his dad had run off. Emily withdrew, finding comfort in her drawings. She filled her notebooks with forests, rivers, and trails, her lines always fading into mist. One Sunday, Laura drove to the Timber Falls Sheriff's Office to speak with Harper again. He looked older than she remembered, the strain of months of failure carved into his face. "There's nothing new, Laura," he said, voice low. "We've checked every lead twice." "There has to be something," she insisted. "Someone must have seen him." He shook his head. "Sometimes people get tired. They walk away." Laura's eyes flashed. "Not Kevin, he wouldn't do that to his kids." Her voice trembled, but there was conviction in it. Harper had no answer. He simply nodded, the silence between them thick with what neither dared to say. By winter, the town had moved on. The search fundraisers ended. The flyers were taken down. Timber Falls went back to its routines, though every resident remembered. When Laura passed by the grocery store, conversations faltered. People pitied her, admired her strength, but also whispered about debts, about secrets, about a man too good to be true. At home, she gathered her children on the couch one evening. "We'll keep his memory alive," she told them softly. "And we'll never stop believing." Outside, snow began to fall over the silent woods. The mountains loomed distant and unreadable, holding their secrets close. But in Laura's heart, one promise burned steady through the cold. Kevin Blake hadn't left them. Something else had taken him. 5 years had passed since Kevin Blake vanished, and the rhythm of life in Timber Falls had settled into something that resembled normalcy, though for Laura and her children, normal had taken on a different meaning. The house felt smaller now, quieter. The framed photo of Kevin in his firefighter uniform had become part of the background, yet every glance at it still pulled a thread loose in Laura's chest. It was late summer of 2008, when the past came calling again. Mark Blake, Kevin's younger brother, was cleaning out their late father's workshop, a small shed behind his old house in Bend, Oregon. Dust covered every tool and drawer, relics of decades spent fixing things that never seemed truly broken. Mark had nearly finished when he noticed a loose panel at the back of an old toolbox. Inside, folded neatly beneath rusted screws and scraps of wire, was an envelope yellowed with age. His name was written on the front in Kevin's familiar handwriting. Mark froze. His pulse quickened as he unfolded the letter. The words were uneven, rushed. "Mark, there's something I have to do. It's about Dad's land and what really happened out there years ago. I can't let it go. Tell Laura I love her and that I'll make it right. If anything happens, look near Timber Falls. There's more buried than just trees." Mark read it twice, his throat tightening. The date, June 12, 2003, was 2 days before Kevin disappeared. He drove to Timber Falls that night, headlights cutting through mist and pine shadows. When Laura opened the door and saw him standing there, pale and shaking, She thought for a second she was dreaming. "Mark, what is it?" He handed her the letter. "I found this in Dad's toolbox," he said quietly. "It's from Kevin." Laura's fingers trembled as she unfolded the note. She read it once, then again, tears welling. "He was trying to tell us something," she whispered. "He knew something dangerous." They sat in silence for a long time, the air between them thick with disbelief and a flicker of hope. For years, Laura had fought against the idea that Kevin had walked away. Now there it was, his words, his handwriting, his voice echoing across time. The next morning, Laura went to see Sheriff Harper. He was retired now, running a small bait shop near the lake, but when he saw her standing at his counter with the letter in her hand, his expression darkened with the weight of old ghosts. "This is real?" he asked, scanning the page carefully. "It's his handwriting," Laura said. "He mentioned Dad's land, something buried. What could he have meant?" Harper exhaled slowly. "I don't know. But maybe we missed something back then." Laura looked out toward the lake, its surface rippling under the morning sun. For the first time in years, she felt movement inside the stillness, a sense that the truth hadn't vanished with Kevin. It was still out there, waiting to be unearthed. Sheriff Daniel Harper sat at his kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of him. The words had begun to blur after hours of staring. Outside, rain streaked down the window, soft and relentless. His wife moved quietly around the room, sensing the old restlessness that had returned to him. "You're thinking about that case again," she said softly. He didn't look up. "It never really left me." Across town, Laura sat with Mark in her living room. The kids were older now, Ben in college, Emily finishing high school, and Noah nearly grown, but Kevin's absence still lived in every corner of the house. Mark's eyes drifted to the fireplace mantel, where Kevin's photograph still stood. "You know what this means," he said. "Whatever Dad was part of, Kevin found out." Laura frowned. "Dad was a logger. What could he have possibly done that would get someone hurt?" Mark hesitated. "It wasn't just logging. There were rumors, illegal dumping up near the ridge in the 80s. Toxic waste, maybe. I always thought they were just stories." Laura's pulse quickened. "And Kevin started digging into it?" "Looks like it," Mark said grimly. "He must have found something. Maybe he planned to go to the authorities." By the next morning, Harper drove to the county records office. The clerk, an old friend named Walt, raised an eyebrow when Harper asked for land ownership files from the 1980s. "You're digging into old ghosts, Danny," he warned. "Maybe," Harper replied, "but one of them's been missing for 25 years. The files told a story the sheriff had never been allowed to see. The company that had owned the disputed land, Lowell Timber Co., had gone bankrupt just after Kevin's disappearance. The owner, Arthur Lowell, had become one of Timber Falls' most influential men, investing in real estate, schools, and the town's main lumber mill. Harper sat in his truck afterward, the weight of the revelation pressing against his chest. Kevin had worked for Lowell once, helping build outdoor trails for a local recreation project. That connection, combined with the letter's hint about Dad's land, painted a picture Harper didn't want to believe. That evening, he visited Laura again. She was standing by the porch, arms crossed, her eyes distant. "You found something," she said, reading his face before he spoke. Harper nodded slowly. Kevin was looking into something tied to Lowell. There's a chance he found proof of illegal activity near the forest. If he confronted the wrong person... His voice trailed off. Laura looked at him sharply. "You think he was killed?" "I don't know," Harper admitted, "but I think his disappearance wasn't an accident." The words hung between them like fog, thick and suffocating. For years, Laura had lived with uncertainty. Now she was faced with a darker truth, that Kevin might have died not by chance, but by choice to protect something, or someone. As thunder rolled in the distance, Harper folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "If you're ready," he said, "we can reopen this, but once we start digging, there's no going back." Laura met his gaze. "Then we dig." The story of Kevin Blake's disappearance had long since faded from the local news, buried beneath years of other headlines. But for Dana Ruiz, an investigative journalist from Portland, it resurfaced like a splinter under the skin. She had stumbled across the case while researching unsolved missing persons connected to old industrial land disputes. The mention of Lowell Timber Co. caught her eye. The same company accused of environmental violations decades earlier. She sat in her apartment surrounded by printouts, maps, and copies of old police reports. Kevin's smiling photo from 2003 stared back at her from a missing poster. Father of 3, last seen hiking Mount Hood. Dana tapped her pen against the paper. Why didn't anyone question the company connection? She murmured. A week later, she was in Timber Falls. The town looked like it had been carved out of memory itself. Weathered storefronts, a single diner, the smell of cedar and rain. She ordered coffee and listened as locals spoke in hushed tones about the teacher who vanished. When she introduced herself as a journalist, the warmth in their smiles cooled instantly. That story's old news, the waitress said. Best leave it be. But Dana never left things be. That afternoon she found Laura Blake at her modest home on Birchwood Lane. Laura, wary but polite, invited her in. Dana explained her purpose, her tone calm and respectful. I'm not here to sensationalize, she said. I just want to understand what really happened to your husband. Laura studied her carefully, then nodded. Most people stopped asking a long time ago. Maybe it's time someone started again. For hours, Laura recounted everything, from the day Kevin disappeared to the discovery of the letter. Dana listened intently, jotting notes, her questions precise but compassionate. You said your brother-in-law found the letter, she asked. Have you shown it to anyone besides Sheriff Harper? Only him, Laura replied, and I'm not sure he wants it reopened. Too many people have too much to lose. Dana leaned forward. What about you? Are you ready for what the truth might cost? Laura hesitated. After 25 years, the cost doesn't scare me anymore. The silence does. Later, Dana visited the county courthouse to request records from the 1980s. She was met with polite refusals, delayed responses, and conveniently misplaced files. You'll need special authorization, the clerk said, avoiding her eyes. That night, she parked outside the shuttered office, the glow from her laptop illuminating her determined face as she typed notes. The same name kept appearing across property transfers and permits, Arthur Lowell. The next morning, she stopped by Harper's bait shop. The old sheriff recognized her type immediately, persistent, fearless, a little reckless. You're digging where others quit, he said. Maybe that's what's needed, Dana replied. You were there from the start. Tell me, did something feel off back then? Harper sighed. Everything did. But in this town, the truth's got deep roots. As Dana walked back to her car, the rain started again, soft but steady. She looked toward the ridge where Kevin had vanished 25 years ago and whispered to herself, then I'll start digging too. The first real break came by accident. It was early spring of 2028 when 2 hikers, a father and daughter from Portland, veered off the main Timber Ridge Trail after spotting a patch of wildflowers along a dried creek bed. The father noticed something strange sticking out from beneath the roots of a fallen pine, rubber and fabric weathered by time. At first he thought it was trash. Then he saw the shape of a boot, still laced. They contacted local authorities immediately. Within hours, sheriff's deputies sealed off the area. The call reached Harper, who, though long retired, drove to the site anyway. He stood behind the yellow tape, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, heart pounding with something between dread and relief. It's the same model Kevin used to wear, one deputy muttered. When the medical examiner's team arrived, they uncovered more. Fragments of clothing, a rusted watch, and buried beneath layers of soil and stone, skeletal remains. Time had nearly erased identity, but not entirely. News spread through Timber Falls like wildfire. Laura heard about it from Ben, who called her in disbelief. Mom, he said, voice trembling, they think they found Dad. Laura's knees went weak. She sank into a chair, gripping the phone as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Where? She whispered. Near the mountain, Ben replied. They're sending everything for testing. The next weeks passed in a blur of waiting. Dana Ruiz returned to town the day after the discovery, camera in hand, notebook overflowing. She interviewed hikers, deputies, and Harper, whose stoic exterior had begun to crack. "I thought I'd made peace with never knowing," he admitted, "but now I can't stop wondering if I missed something all those years ago." When the DNA results finally arrived, confirmation came swiftly. The remains were Kevin Blake's. Laura sat at the kitchen table as the sheriff, Harper's successor, delivered the news. "It's him," he said gently. "There's no doubt." She nodded, silent tears running down her face. Ben stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Emily and Noah joined them, their grief quiet, shaped more by years of absence than shock. For so long, they had imagined him lost in some faraway wilderness. Now the wilderness had given him back. Dana recorded a short message outside the police station that evening. Her voice was steady but laced with emotion. "After 25 years, the remains of Kevin Blake have been found near Mount Hood. What was once mystery now reopens as a search for truth. How did a father of 3 vanish so completely? And why here?" That night, Timber Falls fell silent again. People gathered in small groups, whispering over dinner tables, trying to make sense of a story that refused to rest. Some prayed, others speculated. Laura stood on her porch, watching the dark outline of the mountain beneath the stars. The air was still, the same quiet that had haunted her since 2003. Only now that silence felt heavier, because the woods had finally spoken, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what they'd said. The official report listed the cause of death as undetermined, but for Sheriff Harper, who reviewed the preliminary findings alongside the county coroner, that word didn't sit right. Kevin Blake's skeletal remains told a story of violence hidden beneath the surface of time. Multiple fractures, the coroner explained, tracing a finger along a photograph. Left ribs, 2 vertebrae, jawbone, all consistent with blunt force trauma. But there's no evidence of a fall that high up. The terrain doesn't match. Harper frowned. "So someone hit him?" The coroner hesitated. "It's possible. But after 25 years, certainty's a luxury we don't have." A chill settled over the room. Harper leaned back, staring at the folder. "Then we'll have to find certainty the hard way." Meanwhile, the lab results from Kevin's clothing arrived. DNA traces that didn't belong to him were recovered from the inner lining of his jacket, faint but present. The report listed it as partial match unidentified male. It shouldn't have been possible after so long, but there it was, a fragment of someone else's presence, trapped in the fibers of the fabric Kevin wore the day he vanished. When Laura learned about it, her reaction was instant and visceral. "You mean someone was with him?" she said, voice trembling with disbelief. "He wasn't alone," Harper nodded carefully. "It looks that way." Her hands tightened around the edge of the kitchen table. "Then it wasn't an accident." The sheriff didn't argue. He couldn't. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Timber Falls. Old rumors reignited like dry tinder. At the diner, conversations turned quiet when Laura walked in. Some said the DNA must have been contamination. Others whispered that Kevin had crossed paths with someone powerful, someone the town still depended on. Ben, now a grown man with a family of his own, drove back from Seattle to stand beside his mother. "I can't stop thinking," he told her. "If he found something out there, something big, someone made sure he'd never talk." Laura looked at her son, his jaw set just like his father's. "That letter. He knew he was walking into danger," she said softly. "And they made sure no one would find out." Dana Ruiz returned to Timber Falls to cover the new developments. She met Harper outside the courthouse, notebook in hand. "DNA, broken ribs, no fall marks," she listed. "That's not an accident. That's a cover-up." Harper sighed. "You want my opinion?" "This town's been living under someone's thumb for decades, but evidence this old, it's like chasing smoke." "Then we chase it," Dana replied, "until we find the fire." The two shared a look of mutual understanding, an alliance born not from trust, but from necessity. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She opened Kevin's old hiking journal, running her fingers over the faded ink. One phrase stood out among the notes: Truth has roots, it always finds a way to grow. She closed the book and whispered to the darkness, then let it grow. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, the same trees that had guarded the truth for a quarter of a century. Ben Blake had inherited his father's quiet resolve. Now 37, he looked more like Kevin than ever. The same thoughtful eyes, the same calm that disguised the storm beneath. When the DNA report became public, Ben couldn't sit still. He drove from Seattle to Timber Falls overnight, his thoughts pounding with one unshakable truth. Someone had killed his father, and no one had ever been held accountable. Laura met him at the door, exhaustion etched deep into her face. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Ben replied. "I can't keep pretending it's over." They sat together in the kitchen, the same table where years earlier he'd done his homework while Kevin read beside him. Now the air between them was heavy with unspoken anger. "I've been reading everything Dana Ruiz published," Ben said. "She's getting close, Mom, but the police, they're moving too slow." Laura sighed. "Harper's doing what he can. After all this time, it's complicated." "Complicated?" Ben's tone sharpened. "Dad's ribs were broken. There's another man's DNA on his jacket." "That's not complicated, that's criminal." Laura flinched at his words but didn't argue. She had learned long ago that grief hardened differently in each of them. For her, it became endurance. For Ben, it became fire. Later that day, Ben met with Dana at a cafe near the courthouse. She looked up from her laptop, a mix of curiosity and admiration crossing her face. "You're Kevin's oldest," she said. "I've been hoping to talk to you." "I'm not here for interviews," Ben replied. "I want to help. Tell me what you need." Dana hesitated. "I've been following a paper trail, old land records, company filings. Every time I get close, files go missing or requests get denied. Someone's still protecting the people your father was investigating." "Then we stop asking permission," Ben said firmly. "We find it ourselves." For the first time, Dana saw in him the same tenacity that had driven Kevin to uncover the truth 25 years ago. "You really are your father's son," she said quietly. Over the next few days, Ben visited the forest where Kevin's remains had been found. The air was cool, the scent of moss and rain thick around him. He stood at the creek bed and felt the strange familiarity of the place, as though some part of his father lingered there. He knelt beside the soil and whispered, "I'm going to finish what you started." Back in town, the whispers grew louder. Some locals admired the Blakes' courage, others warned them to stop stirring old ghosts. At the hardware store, an older man muttered as Ben passed, "You dig too deep, boy, you might not like what you find." Ben turned, his voice calm but steady. "I'm not looking for what I like, I'm looking for the truth." When he got home, Laura was waiting. "You sound just like him," she said softly. Ben met her gaze. "Then maybe this time that'll make a difference." And for the first time in years, she almost believed him. The deeper Dana Ruiz dug into Timber Falls' history, the more inconsistencies she uncovered. Property transfers with missing signatures, permits filed under shell companies, payments authorized by people who no longer existed. Every path led back to one name, Arthur Lowell. The same man who decades earlier had built the fortune that shaped the entire town. At the public library, Dana spread the documents across a wooden table, her laptop casting a pale light against the yellowed pages. Ben sat beside her, his brow furrowed. "You're saying Lowell's company was still active after it shut down?" "On paper, yes," Dana said. "But these accounts kept moving money through subsidiaries until 2005. That's 2 years after your dad disappeared." Ben leaned back, jaw tightening. "He must have found evidence of it. That's why he mentioned unfinished business." Dana nodded. "And that letter about the land, I think he discovered that the so-called reforestation project was just a cover. They were dumping chemical waste and hiding it under soil contracts." Ben's pulse quickened. "And Lowell couldn't let that come out." When Dana requested official copies of the documents from the county archives, she was told they'd been misplaced during digital conversion. The clerk avoided her eyes as she spoke. Later that night, Dana received an anonymous envelope slipped under her hotel door. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Kevin Blake shaking hands with Arthur Lowell at a charity event in 2002, and another of Kevin's truck parked near Lowell's private logging site, the same area where his remains were found. Ben stared at the photos for a long moment. "Someone's trying to scare us off," he said finally. "Or warn us," Dana replied. "Either way, they know we're close." Meanwhile, Harper, now in declining health, watched the story unfold from the quiet of his small lakeside home. When Dana called him for comment, he hesitated before answering. "I always suspected Lowell had something to hide," he said hoarsely. "But back then, no one would touch him. He owned the mill, the land, half the council. You spoke against him, you lost your job, or worse." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Dana pressed. "I had no proof," Harper said, "and people I trusted told me to let it go. I thought I was protecting the town. Turns out, I was protecting the wrong man." The next morning, Ben drove out to the old Lowell timber site. The gate was rusted but still locked. He stood there for a long time, staring at the trees beyond, feeling the weight of what his father might have seen. "He walked into this place thinking he could fix it," Ben whispered. "He must have realized too late that some things weren't meant to be fixed." That night he called Dana. "Whatever happens," he said, "we don't stop. Not until Lowell answers for what he did." Dana's reply was steady. "Then we keep going, no matter who tries to bury the truth." Neither of them noticed the dark car idling across the street, headlights off, watching. By the time the investigation reached its breaking point, the truth was no longer just rumor, it was undeniable. Dana's expose had spread beyond Timber Falls, picked up by regional networks. Her story outlined how Arthur Lowell's company had falsified environmental reports for years, using state land for illegal waste disposal. But the most damning revelation came when Harper, despite failing health, came forward with a confession of his own. He met Dana and Ben in his small living room, oxygen machine humming quietly beside him. His hands trembled as he unfolded a stack of faded reports. "I kept these," he said, voice thin but steady. "Lowell paid off inspectors and pressured me to close Kevin's case, told me the evidence would ruin the town's economy. I signed the final report knowing it was wrong." Ben's eyes burned. "You knew my father didn't just disappear?" "I suspected," Harper admitted. "But suspicion doesn't stand up in court, son. And by the time I realized how deep it went, I'd already buried the truth with him." Dana reached for the documents. "We can use this. It proves obstruction." 2 weeks later, federal agents arrived in Timber Falls. The town watched as black SUVs rolled past the courthouse. Lowell, now in his 70s, was led out of his mansion in handcuffs. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. The once untouchable businessman kept his head high, expression unreadable. At the press conference, the lead investigator announced the charges: manslaughter, obstruction of justice, falsifying federal records. The room erupted in whispers. Laura watched the broadcast from home. Her hands trembled as she muted the TV. For a long moment, she just stared at Kevin's photograph on the mantel, whispering, "You were right all along." Later that day, Ben drove to the courthouse. The steps were crowded with journalists and townspeople. As he pushed through, Lowell was being escorted inside, wrists bound, his once iron confidence cracking for the first time. Their eyes met briefly, 2 generations divided by truth. "You destroyed my family," Ben said quietly. Lowell paused, his voice rough with age. "Your father was stubborn. He didn't understand how the world works." Ben's jaw tightened. No, he just refused to let it rot. Inside, Dana stood by the courtroom doors, notebook in hand. She gave Ben a nod of solidarity. "It's not justice yet," she said, "but it's the start." The trial would take months, but that day marked something deeper. A fracture in the silence that had defined Timber Falls for a quarter of a century. Neighbors who once looked away now spoke openly. Old employees of Lowell Timber began coming forward, each story another piece of the same puzzle. That night, Harper passed away peacefully in his sleep. On his nightstand was a note addressed to Laura. The truth finally found its voice. "Forgive me for the years I let it stay quiet." Laura held the letter against her chest, tears falling freely. For the first time in decades, the weight of not knowing lifted. Justice was slow, imperfect, and late, but it had finally arrived. The spring following Arthur Lowell's arrest arrived with an unusual stillness in Timber Falls. The air smelled cleaner, lighter, as if the town itself was exhaling after holding its breath for 25 years. The courthouse stood quiet now, its front steps no longer crowded with cameras. Justice, though delayed, had left its mark. For the Blake family, the aftermath carried a weight all its own. Kevin's remains were released to Laura, who arranged a funeral at the small church near the river where they'd once been married. The day was bright, the kind of soft sunlight Kevin had loved. Friends, former students, and townspeople gathered in silence, many clutching wildflowers instead of roses. Laura stood before the simple wooden casket, her hands trembling as she spoke. For years I prayed for answers. I thought finding them would bring peace, but peace doesn't come from knowing. It comes from accepting. Kevin never stopped fighting for what was right, even when it cost him everything. Today, we honor that courage. Ben followed, his voice steady though emotion rippled beneath it. My dad wasn't a hero in the way people think of heroes. He didn't wear a uniform or save lives on television. He just believed that truth mattered, that what's buried always finds its way to light. He taught me that you can lose everything and still stand for something. Emily and Noah stood together near the front pew, holding hands. Emily whispered, "He'd be proud of us." Noah nodded. "He already is." After the service, they buried Kevin at the edge of the forest, not far from the trail he'd once loved. As the last shovelful of soil fell, Laura felt something inside her finally loosen. A quiet release that wasn't relief, but something close. That evening, she and Ben walked along the riverbank, the sound of rushing water filling the spaces between their words. "It's strange," Ben said, watching the current. "I used to think justice would fix everything, but it doesn't. It just stops the bleeding." Laura smiled faintly. "Maybe that's enough." Over the next months, Timber Falls began to change. The new mayor announced a program to restore the damaged forest and convert Lowell's abandoned land into a protected conservation area. Harper's name was added to a memorial plaque in front of the sheriff's office, honoring those who served truth, even when it came late. Dana Ruiz returned one final time to finish her documentary. She filmed the town square, the school where Kevin had taught, the trail that had become both a wound and a monument. "This story," she narrated softly, "isn't just about a man who vanished. It's about a community learning to face what it tried to forget." At home, Laura placed Kevin's old compass on the mantel beside his photo. The needle still swung north, steady and faithful. She thought of his words, written years ago in his journal, "Right doesn't disappear even when people do." The sun dipped low behind the pines, and for the first time in decades, Timber Falls didn't feel haunted. It felt whole again. Months after the trial ended, Dana Ruiz sat in her Portland apartment, surrounded by stacks of transcripts, photographs, and sound recordings. The story that had once consumed her now felt complete, yet she couldn't bring herself to let it go. She scrolled through old footage, Laura's trembling voice, Ben's determined stare, Harper's final interview. Each image was a reminder that behind every headline there were hearts that had broken quietly in the dark. Her documentary, The Man Who Never Left, premiered on a crisp October evening. The theater was small but filled to capacity. Journalists, locals from Timber Falls, and families of other missing persons sat side by side. When the lights dimmed and the first words appeared on screen, silence fell over the room. Dana narrated with a calm, steady tone. "In a town built on timber and secrets, one man's disappearance exposed the roots of silence and the courage it takes to break it." The film traced Kevin's life, not as a mystery, but as a legacy. His laughter echoed in home videos, his children's voices narrated passages from his journals. When the ending came, Kevin's compass resting beside the words, "He made it home," many in the audience wept. After the credits rolled, applause filled the theater. Laura stood quietly in the back, tears streaming down her face. Ben hugged her, whispering, he'd have thanked her too. Dana walked over moments later, eyes red but smiling. "Your story changed people," she told Laura. "No," Laura replied softly. "Kevin's did. You just helped the world hear it." The documentary aired nationwide a week later, sparking discussions across communities about unsolved disappearances and corporate accountability. Other families reached out to Dana, sharing their stories, their grief, and their hope. For every mystery that remained unsolved, the Blake case became a symbol that truth could outlast silence. One evening, Dana returned to Timber Falls to visit Kevin's gravesite. The forest was quiet, painted in shades of amber and gold. She knelt by the simple wooden cross and placed a single pine cone beside it. "You gave me more than a story," she whispered. "You reminded me what truth costs and why it's worth paying." Before leaving town, she stopped by the school where Kevin had taught. A new plaque hung at the entrance, in memory of Kevin Blake, teacher, father, seeker of truth. Beneath it was a quote he'd once written on a chalkboard, preserved in his handwriting: "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching." Dana smiled, feeling the weight of closure settle gently in her chest. As she drove away, she recorded a final note into her voice recorder. "The story of Kevin Blake is not about a man who vanished. It's about a family that refused to forget, a sheriff who faced his past, and a town that learned silence is never peace." Stories like this remind us that truth doesn't fade. It waits for someone willing to listen. She paused, exhaled softly, and added, "And I listened." A year after the documentary's release, the Blake family gathered once more at Mount Hood National Forest. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and melting snow. Laura, Ben, Emily, and Noah hiked the same trail Kevin had taken 26 years before, their steps steady but unhurried. Each carried something small to leave behind, a token of memory, a piece of love made tangible. They stopped near the creek bed, where Kevin's remains had been found. The forest, once heavy with mystery, now felt calm, its silence no longer threatening but sacred. Ben knelt to clear a patch of earth, setting down a carved wooden sign that read, "He made it home." Emily traced the letters with her fingers, tears glinting in her eyes. "It feels right," she whispered. Laura looked around at the trees swaying gently above them. "He always said this place made him feel alive," she murmured. "Now it'll keep him alive." They stood together in quiet reflection. Years of pain, anger, and uncertainty seemed to dissolve into something purer: acceptance. The mountain that had once taken Kevin from them now offered him back in a different form, one that lived in their memories, their choices, and their strength. Ben turned to his siblings. "You know, I used to hate this place," he admitted. "But Dad, he saw beauty here. I think he'd want us to see it too." Noah smiled faintly. "Then we should keep coming back." Laura nodded. "As long as there's a path, we'll follow it." As they prepared to leave, a light breeze stirred the trees. Pine needles drifted gently to the ground, and for a moment it felt like the forest was breathing with them. Alive, forgiving, eternal. Back in Timber Falls, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The conservation project, named in Kevin's honor, had restored the damaged lands, and a new hiking trail, the Blake Route, wound through the forest he once loved. Visitors often stopped at the wooden sign by the creek, unaware of the long story buried beneath its simple words. That evening, Laura sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the sunset spilling gold across the horizon. She thought of Kevin, the sound of his laughter, the steadiness of his voice, the way he used to hum while fixing things around the house. "We found you," she whispered to the fading light. "And we'll keep walking, just like you did." In her heart, she knew that stories like theirs never truly ended. They just kept moving, like rivers that curved through the earth, reshaping everything they touched. If stories like Kevin Blake's move you, subscribe for more true stories that seek truth and honor. Tales of resilience, love, and the human spirit's refusal to give up. And don't stop here. Click the next video on your screen to uncover another real mystery that finally found justice. Sometimes, the hardest paths lead to the clearest truths. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the trail glowed faintly in the twilight, and somewhere in the rustling of the trees, the story of Kevin Blake continued, enduring, eternal, and finally at peace.